Perfect. So good afternoon. Thanks so much for joining us today at the Alma Jordan Library on the St. Augustine campus of the University of the West Indies here in Trinidad. And I am so pleased to be here to introduce and to chair our session with these wonderful speakers. I am Dr. Shalene Gomes. Please call me Shalene, and I'm one of the editors of the Race, Class, and Nationalism in the 21st Century Caribbean. This is the volume. We finally have it in our hands. So it arrived in Trinidad and Tobago. And the other contributors from around the world also should have gotten their hard copies. And so we bring together today a few of the Trinidad and Tobago based contributors. Before I introduce the speakers and sort of frame our discussion today, I would like to thank very much the library staff, especially the Humanities and Social Sciences Division staff. And in particular, Ms. Georgia Alexander, Mr. Kamal Osborne, and Ms. Natasha Richards. So this volume was launched at the World Anthropological Union. And we had Paulo Neves, who is a professor of sociology at the Federal University of ABC in Sao Paulo, Brazil, introduce it and kind of do a review, because Paulo also works on some of these matters of race and class. And so I say this to say that these are concerns, matters, issues that span the Caribbean and the multicultural Caribbean, but also the world, right? So, and thank you very much to the contributors for your time today and for agreeing to be here. And I also like to thank Scott Timke, who is the co-editor, who did a great deal of work the volume, and he works in general on political economy, economic history, and imperialism. In Trinidad, if anybody wants to buy copies, there are a few copies at Paper-Based Bookshop. So please look out for them there. And so to kind of frame the volume, what we have done in this multicultural, multidisciplinary volume is look at the political dynamics of the multicultural Caribbean. Matters of race, class, and nationalism across the French, English, Spanish, and Dutch-speaking Caribbean. In identifying these linguistic groups, we're not trying to privilege these particular European languages and Indo-European languages, nor are we neglecting the plurality of language expression in the region. But what we're doing is tracing the histories and the contemporary realities of social, cultural, and political change. So two of the organizing questions we had in mind in compiling this volume were, one, what are the present historical material factors that shape the expression of nationalist sentiments in the region? And secondly, what might an approach that centers class relations reveal about the conceptualization of local struggles, as well as how these struggles intermesh with the tendencies introduced by neoliberal democracy and its justification of elite enrichment. So we organized the volume into four broad thematic areas. First, formation and formulations. And Dylan Carrigan and Stanley Griffin have chapters in that section, looking at Leeward Islander regionalism in Antigua and Barbuda, and looking at the post-colonial state violence through a social history of woodwork in Trinidad. The second section, history and activism, in which I have a chapter with Maria Gomes and Antonio Mungo, looks at how Caribbean women have historically done productive and reproductive work that has been undervalued economically and socially for the state, family, and community. And so simply recognizing this as work, right, this caring that's constantly done, and the social reproduction as labor, is a really important point. So Amilcar also has a chapter that he will speak about in this section. The third section is domination and expression, and you will hear from Sabrina and Jerome, Dr. Chinian and Dr. Kilatsing. And the fourth section is material and international pressures. You will hear from About Anita and Ruben's chapter from Dr. Anita Montut. So in various ways, the contributors argue that notions of racial identity have changed over time, but these changes are not independent of nation building processes or of class rule. Despite the many studies on nationalism in the Caribbean, few have attempted to look at the phenomenon as a political invention that does not and cannot serve the interests of all. And I hope we will have some time for some spirited discussion about this. How essentialist over-determining nationalism is a political and conceptual confusion that stalls the project of universal human emancipation. And in considering nationalism as a political ideology of the modern era that binds people together, we also point to race as a malleable fiction of modernity, not as a set of innate characteristics, but one category nonetheless that has very real consequences for people the world over. So centering the concept of class and understanding these social dynamics in the 21st century has become more acute, right, as we know in the last few months, when it looks like we may also be coming up against another world economic depression, while we are also confronting a climate crisis. And so historical moments are complex and cannot be explained by any simple correlation between race, nationalism, and ideology. Our position is that the sociological task is to analyze the material factors that give rise to these subjective expressions and experiences, and not to cynically use them to rule and perpetuate capitalist exploitation. So to take this debate forward, our contributors have sought to concentrate on what is the project of self-determination outside of capitalism, while also examining how contemporary elites enamored with nationalism undermine that struggle. The critique in this volume is less about chastising people and individuals with power. That is not part of our project, but it is more about examining systems that reproduce inequalities and the interests of groups in perpetuating these systems. So to round off this introduction, I would like to repeat some of C.L.R. James's remarks in the appendix to his 1963 edition of the Black Jacobins. And James says, in 1963, the old colonial system is not what it was in 1863. In 1863, it was not what it had been in 1963 or 1663. But, he writes, the fundamentals have not changed. And many other Caribbeanists have also engaged in this debate. Think about the spirited anthropological and sociological debates about whether race or class matters more. Instead, our goal in this volume was to undertake a collective political analysis driven by a positive commitment to liberation in all its forms. And if nationalism thrives by silencing these fundamentals, in this volume, we hope to have formed an understanding of how and why race and class both matter to comprehend the contemporary Caribbean. So I would like to introduce the speakers. So please, first, I want to introduce everyone and then they will speak. First, Dr. Sabrina Chinian has written the chapter Thinking Beyond the Coloniality of Power with Patrick Chamossieur. Dr. Chinian is a senior lecturer in French, Francophone literatures and film here at the St. Augustine campus of UWI. She is an associate member of the Claire Sefla Research Group at Bordeaux University in France, and a member of the African Federation of Film Critics in Dakar, Senegal. Her areas of focus are mostly on Francophone, Caribbean, and African literatures, as well as Caribbean and African film. And then Mr. Amilcar Peter Samathan, who is next to Dr. Chinian, is, I'm sure everyone knows, has authored the chapter Masculinism and Gender Power Relations in the Caribbean Left. And Amilcar is an artist, academic, and activist. He is a PhD candidate in cultural studies here at the St. Augustine campus. His research and social leadership center on men and masculinities in the Caribbean and the Americas, gender justice, literary and performing arts, youth and student development, as well as human geography. Next, Dr. Jerome Tilak Singh, at the end, has authored the chapter Moving Beyond Narrow Nationalist Historiography. Dr. Tilak Singh is a senior lecturer here also at the St. Augustine campus of UWI. His books include Ideology, Politics, and Radicalism of the Afro-Caribbean, Civil Rights in America and the Caribbean, 1950s through 2010s, and Labor and the Decolonization Struggle in Trinidad and Tobago. Dr. Tilak Singh has served as the Deputy Chair of the Board of Governors of Cipriani College of Labour and Cooperative Studies here in Trinidad and Tobago, and he is a member of the Leverhulme Project Advisory Board for the project Trade Unions and Spaces of Democratization in Britain, the Caribbean, and Greece. And so we also are standing in, well, I should say I am also a trade union member here. So Dr. Anita Montoute is here at the end, and Dr. Montoute is going to speak about her chapter. And she's also going to kind of conclude our session by talking a bit about Caribbean futures and the future of the Caribbean. Dr. Montoute has co-authored the chapter China and the Caribbean Beyond South-South Relations. She is a senior lecturer at the Institute of International Relations, also on campus, where she recently served as acting director. Her research interests are civil society and the Caribbean's external relations. She is the co-author of Changing Cuba-US Relations, Implications for CARICOM States, and co-editor of the ACP Group and the EU Development Partnership Beyond the North-South Debate. So thank you again so much, everybody, for joining us today. And we hope to have the recording of the speakers' presentations up live at some point in time. So look out for that as well. So I hand over now to Dr. Chinian. Thank you. Mic a bit closer.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So I will give a brief overview of my chapter entitled Patrick Chamoiseau, Going Beyond the Coloniality of Power. Okay, Patrick Chamoiseau is a Martinican writer born in 1953. So he studied law in Paris. He's a social worker until now, an urban planner for several towns in Martinique, but most importantly, he's also a multifaceted artist. He's an essayist, a theorist, a playwright, a novelist, a scriptwriter. So in his work, Chamoiseau constructs, deconstructs, and reconstructs narratives and discourses of nationness. In his works also, the nation comes into being as a structure of cultural signification, a national identity reconstructed out of the memory of various historical traumas. His works are firmly rooted in the Martinican context, and his aim is that, I quote, "We talk to ourselves, for ourselves, and through the echo, let our voices be heard by others." He's strongly influenced by both Aimé Césaire and Edouard Glissant, and particularly by their defined notions of identity. In the case of Césaire, the notion of root identity, and in the case of Glissant, the notion of rhizome identity. Martinique is in an ambivalent situation because it's part of France, it's a département d'outre-mer, it's a DOM, it's part of the EU, but culturally it's closer to other Caribbean islands because of a shared history of enslavement and colonialism. So Chamoiseau actually conceptualizes this ambivalence in his work. So the term coloniality of power, I'm using Gross-Fogel's definition of it. So it means, according to him, a crucial structuring process in the modern world system that articulates peripheral locations in the international division of labor. So for Chamoiseau, peripheral nation states and non-European people are still under the regime of global coloniality, imposed by the United States through the IMF, the World Bank, Pentagon, and NATO. So given their pervasiveness, these colonialities shape politics, race, class, and also nationalism. So Chamoiseau talks about different types of domination in his works. So according to him, France has to get rid of its colonial mindset, right? And he conceptualizes three types of political dominations in his essay Écrire un pays dominé, which is writing in a dominated country. So he talks about the brutal domination, which is violence, genocide, and so on. The silent domination through the church, religion, education, and the hospital, medicine, and so on. And also what he calls the furtive domination, which is more like neoliberalism, capitalism, and so on. So Chamoiseau condemns neoliberalism and capitalism, which for him are an integral part of the worldwide issue of immigration. In Frères Migrants, Migrant Brothers, he denounces the neoliberal system, resulting in, I quote, exclusion, rejection, violence, nonsense, hate, and indecency that ferment everywhere. So Pierre Bourdieu is an influential French sociologist, anthropologist, and he has coined the term symbolic capital. For him, the symbolic capital is not directly financial, right? It is the economic capital that is wealth. What can wealth bring you? The social capital and the cultural capital. And in his works, Chamoiseau questions what symbolic capital France is imposing upon Martinique. So these are the questions that come out of his works. Does the Western world exploit its symbolic capital? Does the process of political and economic colonization morph into an intellectual colonization through the dominant language? If you see the works of Césaire, for instance, Césaire, his works are so revolutionary, Vive la négritude, and so on. But Césaire rarely, if ever, use a Creole word in his works. Whereas with the Creolists, with Blisson and so on, like Chamoiseau, Bernabé, Confiant, they would all integrate Creole words within their books, right? So he also questions if there is a pedagogical hierarchy where the Cartesian Western forms of pedagogy are considered superior to non-Western concepts and practices of pedagogy. So all these questions about the symbolic capital come out in the different works of Chamoiseau. So how does Chamoiseau think beyond the coloniality of power? So by examining the ramification of the colonial power matrix within Martinique, and also by analyzing the power hierarchies within the world system. He's in favor, for instance, in the case of Martinique, of more economic independence. And he also pinpoints to all the areas which need to be addressed and has conceptualized possible solutions. The notion of diversality as opposed to universality. Tout monde, which is the whole world, a concept. These are all concepts from Blisson that Chamoiseau has also built on and expanded upon. And there is also what he calls himself, Chamoiseau calls himself the warrior of the imaginary, right? Because for him, the coloniality of power is not so much a political project as an epistemological project. You need to change the mindset of people first, right? So what is the warrior of the imaginary? So he denounces the coloniality of power because for Chamoiseau, coloniality of power is strongly associated with the coloniality of knowledge, which is deeply imbricated in the structures of European colonial domination. So for him, the role of the warrior of the imaginary is to deconstruct that coloniality of knowledge by identifying and acknowledging all Francophone, but also non-Francophone sources of knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zingin.
Good afternoon, everyone. The title of my chapter is Masculinism and Gender-Powered Relations in the Caribbean Left. And I would read excerpts which I believe provides an overview by the book. It doesn't make us any money, right? But the goal is to mobilize buying the book. You know, is what it is. So, in 2018, the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute for Social and Economic Studies hosted a symposium Whither the Left in the Caribbean. With hindsight, the primary purpose of the symposium was quite explicit in assessing the legacies of canonical leaders in the independence movement such as Forbes Burnham, Maurice Bishop, Fidel Castro, Hugo Chavez, Chetty Jagan, and Michael Manley. These male icons were centered and given pride of place. While they were all renowned, these figures were complex persons and personalities, whose politics at the time of imperial aggression and limited resources for post-colonial development are subject to question. But it is also true that all of these names have become iconic signifiers standing in for a definitive leftist male occupant of state power in the Caribbean and Americas. Effectively, the symposium provided a misleading representation of the Caribbean left, one that solely relied on male icons. Still, it is worth pausing here to pointedly ask how our understanding of the Caribbean left might shift when we refocus the frame to include people like Janet Jagan, Viola Burnham, Celia Sanchez, Beverly Manley, and Jacqueline Kraft. Might a different analysis of the historical legacies of the Caribbean left emerge? And if so, what are the advantages of this historiography? What intellectual space and programmatic agenda might such a historiography provide? The masculine frame of understanding the Caribbean left contains three primary errors. First, it is partial and unduly selective because it does not reasonably interpret the concrete actions on the ground in many Caribbean liberation movements in which the participation of women was crucial. Next, it gives little attention to the diversity of leftist politics, branches that included socialist feminisms, which critique revolutionary projects for sidelining gender dynamics. Finally, it promotes an intellectual heritage in which at least half of the population of the Caribbean do not see themselves. The chapter illustrates the masculinist character of the leftist political organizations in the Caribbean. The chapter also goes on to explore why the Caribbean left failed to adequately address gender inequalities in their revolutionary agenda. I highlight a pervasive sexism in the scholarship that involves non-engagement with women's rights and feminist theorizing, and of course, gender issues in the analysis of Caribbean studies. The central reference point in this chapter is the Grenada Revolution. Calling back to the earlier question, this chapter sets out to work through the trifecta of assumptions about class, gender, and the state, and show how they continue to shape scholarship produced in that 21st century. In the terms of organization, I discuss feminist historiography to contemporary analyses on the left. Then I provide a background to the political developments of the Grenada Revolution, examining the feminist literature in the revolution. And then I illustrate the masculinist structure of the state and the party during the revolution. So in this work, it's part of a longer inquiry that I have of looking at gender politics and political parties. But this one falls into the parameters of the 20th century in a revolutionary project. If you read the chapter, you would see references to the Grenada Manual and Mentors Workers Union. You would see the role of Eric Gary in the Grenada United Labour Party. And then I look at the revolutionary government by 1979 and assess the National Women's Organization and the anti-feminists and what, looking back, the positions on women's rights that they would have taken that I have a critique of. The National Youth Organization, and then look at some of the proud achievements of the Grenada Revolution, such as the Center for Popular Education and what they have done to redress illiteracy. And this work, I believe, is in conversation with a new historiography and literary writings that have emerged in the region. Professor Mohammed recently published an analysis of Janet Jagan. Beverly Manley has her memoir. We have the work on Claudia Jones, Rhoda Redder could have done pioneering work on Elmer Francois. So I close here on a reflection that I had at an activist event at the UWI. The Grenada Revolution sought to redefine social and economic relations of development as much as it did to redefine manhood for a new group, because a number of the revolutionaries were replacing the early post-independent forms of masculinity. So whereas they had men going by barbers to show that they were good post-colonial subjects, revolutionaries are now wearing afros, where people wore ties and suits to show that they were equal, if not equally bright, and could posture with the post-colonial notion of manhood. Revolutionary wore shirt jacks, wire bearers, bush jackets, as we used to say. Old men in Piaco were to pick you up in the taxi, or your mathematics and geography teacher, Mr. Matura. So there is an aesthetic that they are replacing of one form of the manhood through this revolutionary project. But I also showed that the directions, they were not only trained in the United Kingdom, a number of them were trained in the United States, drawing inspiration from the civil rights movement and a certain type of protest politics, which is at odds with the failed and socialist orientation that you would have had from earlier generation of what we would have referred to as radical leaders. So there's a redefining of manhood in this new group, and a challenge to an older generation of masculine authority. Maurice Bishop was from the capital of Grenada and attended law school in the United Kingdom. Unison Whiteman studied economics at Howard University in the United States. Leaders such as Bishop and Whiteman were a new cohort of educated and middle-class leaders who challenged the hegemony of the earlier independence leaders, often who came from working-class, labor-based movements. So they themselves have a class politics of a new petty bourgeois force. These insights are part of the understudied, but hopefully growing field of masculinities and liberation movements. The arguments about historiography are not academic. They concern the very vitality of contemporary political life. Let me explain by recounting one of my experiences as a socialist student organizer at the University of the West Indies. Between 2016 and 2021, the UWI Socialist Student Conference, in partnership with the Grenada Students Association of Trinidad and Tobago, organized an annual Maurice Bishop lecture. The purpose of the lecture was to reflect on the Grenada Revolution and raise current questions about youth, organizing strategy, gender, sexuality, and democratic freedom, for speakers to learn and exchange with each other. Ultimately, the goal was movement building. At one event, an elderly activist man who actively supported the solidarity events in Trinidad and Tobago for the Grenada Revolution, he urged us, remember, this is about Marxism and the universal principles of Marxism. Feminism and all other issues are okay, but Marxism is about the history of humans and the total revolution of all. Statements like these suggest that Marxist revolution can, in and of itself, repair all social divisions, which also rendering gender relations as peripheral to the conversation about liberation. While I too will be an old activist sooner than I would like, if Caribbean leftist scholarship fails to adopt and make good on the aspiration to undertake an analysis of the totality of social life, inclusive of issues around gender, then it may well be for me or someone of my ilk that perpetuates the idea that Marxism and feminism are essentially incompatible frameworks of analysis. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tilak Singh. Over to you.
Good afternoon to everyone. Should the last two speakers did not use up their time, so I'm going to use the answer. My chapter looks at current issues, and it's very interesting when I did my chapter, I realized that the colonial era, the bedrock of that colonial era was based on injustices, inequalities, inequities, racism, religious discrimination, class discrimination. And these things continued after we got independence throughout the Caribbean. So it bothered me. Why is independence tokenism? You boast of being a republic, and it's tokenism because the problems of the colonial era continued past post-independence and into the 21st century. I looked at Cheddy Jagan. Branded someone who's against capitalism, they got rid of him. And then in 2020, just 5 years ago, David Granger tried to also hold on to elections in Guyana. And after he got pressure, he had to give up. So I'm seeing a trend, in some countries, I'm seeing this trend where colonialism, the ghosts of colonialism are still there haunting us. And I'll give you some examples. The ethnic minorities we have in Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean, the Syrians, the Lebanese, the Jews, the Portuguese. We don't hear about them, We might read them in textbooks in a library, but we don't hear about them. In fact, I told some of my students that we have Jews in the Caribbean and they look shocked. They say, but we don't have something in Europe. That dealing with Hitler, eh? So it's so strange that we don't even know the indigenous groups before the Europeans came, before the Indians and Africans came, before people from the Middle East. We don't even know these indigenous groups. And I've realized there's a certain exclusion that is taking place right now in 2025 that was part of the colonial era. And this is what I bring out in my chapter. And some of the issues that were recently touched on this year and the last 2 years, I mentioned in my chapter. In my chapter, I talk about the issue of the Privy Council. 2020, Mrs. Kamla Prasad Bissessa, she's talking about the Privy Council. You know what she says? Why are there no Indian judges on the Privy Council? So she's looking at ethnicity, yeah? She's not looking at competence. She's saying, she's looking at why we don't have no Indians on the Caribbean Court of Justice, the CCJ. And then last month, the Prime Minister is telling our country to get rid of the Privy Council and use the CCJ. And I was so surprised. I said, but I dealt with this in my chapter. And let me tell you something. It's not just race, it's about religion too. You tell people about the Orisha, the Shango, Shouter Baptists, they would say something negative, or I don't want to deal with them. I tell my students about Obia and Voodoo, and they say, you know what? That is something bad, that is something evil. And the moment they say something evil, I say that's exactly what the planters said, that's exactly what Master said during the slavery era. So just as the colonial had stereotyped and stigmatized a religious minorities, it still continues today. Many of us still have a fear, still have ignorance of these religious minorities. And I'll tell you something else I mentioned in my chapter. I drew attention to students who were turned away from schools because of their dreadlocks. I don't know if that ever happened to you, America. Students were turned away because of their dreadlocks. I think 2 years ago or last year, students from, I think, Trinity School couldn't graduate because they had different hairstyles. I mean, here, but they don't want some principals, they want cornrow hairstyle. That is a colonial era. That's a colonial thing, man. We're 2025, this is 21st century. So in my chapter, I was so surprised to see that many of the problems we're grappling with, and we call ourselves progressive. We call ourselves progressive and we talk about Vision 2020, we talk about we want to move first world status and things. And we're still dealing with a simple thing like hairstyles. Imagine that. Just under my go after bald head people. Now, on the topic of religion, I don't know if you all have been reading the news in the last 2 years, 3 years, but some Hindu temples are desecrated. Some churches are attacked and vandalized. And I mean, I am not a big fan of religion, but respect religion. A simple thing like respecting somebody's religion, we cannot do in Trinidad and Tobago, right? And the rest of the world, they're seeing us because of social media. And they're wondering what is happening to Trinidad and Tobago. And sometimes the only thing they know about us is carnival, Sometimes tourists just come down here for 2 days and that's it. But we have problems that the rest of the world, they are taking note, they are mocking us, making us look bad, that we are desecrating temples, we are vandalizing churches. And after the coup, 1990, and after 9/11, many of my Muslim friends complained to me that they were being victimized. And it wasn't just my Muslim friends, other Muslims in Trinidad and Tobago got a backlash. And you all might also know that we have some Trinidadians who went to Syria to fight. So we also have people who are being branded in Trinidad and Tobago and say, well, you know what? You all are terrorist fighters. And this is what I mentioned in my textbook, that the way, in my chapter, the way that we have grouped people and branded people and stigmatized them, that is what happened during colonialism. That is the essence of colonialism. Those injustices, that stigma still continues today. And I also mentioned in that chapter the issue of the Trinity Cross, the issue of people wanting to pull down the Columbus statue. Two symbols people claim are of colonialism. Now you know what I mentioned in my chapter? I mentioned the Trinity Cross, pulling down Columbus statues, and changing street names. How does that help us? How does that help poverty? It might help your national consciousness. It might make you more patriotic. But I'm saying you're changing the Trinity Cross. You want to pull down the statue, Columbus dead and gone. How is that helping crime? Now, I cannot go and say that outside in public, get stoned down, may get booed down. But this is something that the public need to address. Are we looking at the wrong issues? And are we spending too much time focusing on possibly issues that shouldn't really be discussed? Let's look at healthcare. Let's look at crime. And whilst I was rereading my chapter, I said I mentioned Trinity Cross and Columbus. And just last year, after the book was published, we changed the coat of arms. So you could see that there is this continuity of just doing things, and we have no sort of propaganda. I hope I didn't insult my young friend or offend him and see he went, oh, you just feeling thirsty. And I also, no, I must have people even when I'm talking, 2 more minutes, okay. This borrow time or my time? This borrow time, you catch for time like in football, okay. I want to end up talking about two final things. The party politics I talked about in Trinidad and Tobago, and in my chapter I talk about the influence of people who are light-skinned. We still look up to them. We still feel that people of light skin have power. We still talk in a very defamatory way, sometimes within 1%, right? So I talked about the way in which skin color still holds an important role in our society. Somebody who is light-skinned looks more attractive. That is the mentality we have. In Jamaica, one of the biggest problems? Skin bleaching. Skin bleaching, I think they use a cake soap to bleach their skin. And the last thing I want to mention, I talked about it in the conclusion of my chapter, in that the Caribbean is not really independent. We have Caribbean islands like Turks and Caicos, Aruba, Martinique, where we still have a European presence. And not just a European presence, but some of you all might know those things like Monroe Doctrine and dollar diplomacy. Why must the President of the United States, why must the United States tell us we cannot use doctors from Cuba? Last month, that issue came up a few weeks ago, and in my chapter, I talked about that. The book talks about the independence of the Caribbean, the freedom of the Caribbean countries. So I think it's a very, and I'm glad that Scott and Shireen allowed me that freedom, because sometimes journals reject my articles because I don't have that freedom to express myself, and I got a lot of freedom. The only thing I didn't do is curse in that chapter. And I just want to thank them again for allowing me that freedom to write and express these views where I'm seeing this curse of colonialism, the ghost of colonialism, still present with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good morning good afternoon now to everyone. Yes, so I am very, very pleased for the opportunity to have written a book, a chapter in this book. Thanks to the editors and congratulations to my fellow authors. Now I need to go and read those chapters, very insightful, deep, and definitely need to go through them and take in the details in addition to what I'm going to read. So the name of our chapter is written with Dr. Ruben Gonzalez. The chair said that it's called China and the Caribbean Beyond South-South Relations. In barely 2 decades, the People's Republic of China, or the PRC, has become one of the Caribbean's major trade partners, foreign investors, and international lenders. However, despite the vast and excellent tradition of Caribbean literature on developmental matters, analysis of China-Caribbean relations are mainly technical in nature, neglecting critical local perspectives. The chapter therefore revisits the tradition of critical Caribbean development thought to apply to the study of China-Caribbean relations. By giving the main stage to theories from the region, we hope not only to capture the nuance of Sino-Caribbean relations, but also to restore the work and spirit of scholars who are committed to empowering the region's capacity for agency and independent critical thought. Critical Caribbean development thought offers a theoretical, solid and politically empowering alternative to otherwise predominantly empirical accounts of the Caribbean's relationship with China, raising important questions about continuing epistemic dependency, structural impediments to development in small and highly open states, and a number of unresolved issues relating to the post-colonial condition in former plantation societies. Drawing upon these insights, we explain how the expectations placed on the emerging South-South link with China are easily overstated, given China's elitist business-centric approach to development, the eschewing of participatory approaches to Sino-Caribbean ventures, the passive incorporation of the Caribbean into China's global vision, and the competitive pressures inherent to a consolidated world market. The Caribbean's tradition of critical thinking on development emerged out of a broader effort to resist colonialism and racism, both understood as outcomes of capitalist exploitation. Much of the progressive intellectual scholarship in the region was fueled by and had a symbiotic relationship with radical projects of the 1960s and early 1970s, such as the Rastafarian movement, the Black Power movement, socialism, and the Third World Quest for a new international economic order. As such, Caribbean critical development thought was part of a wider intellectual endeavor about the kind of social, economic, and political order that should be pursued in the post-independence era. Inspired by these multiple movements, many Caribbean intellectuals shared a diagnosis for the underdevelopment of the region, attributing Caribbean underdevelopment to the unequal relations emanating from the Caribbean's passive insertion in the global economy. Prominent among these are Lloyd Best, George Beckford, Carrie Levitt, although we know she was not Caribbean, but if we really think about her, she's Caribbean more than a lot of us. Carrie Levitt, Norman Gilvan, and James Millett. So I'm going to take each of those areas that we've extrapolated from in terms of critical development thought from the Caribbean and deal with them individually in thinking about China's relationship with the Caribbean. So the first one is epistemic dependency. One of the ideas that are taken from Caribbean economic progressive thought is that of epistemic dependency. Epistemic dependency expands the analysis of dependency beyond the economic basis and espouses it as a syndrome of the region's psychological makeup. Therefore, the first step towards an alternative regional vision was the development of independent Caribbean political thought. From Fanon to Beckford or Garvey to Best, Caribbean thinkers place emancipated political thought at the center of the struggle for post-colonial freedom. The question of epistemic dependency continues to burden regional politics, whether this is in the form of elevation of European cultural practices or Washington's holdover regional policy development. Within this context, the PRC's engagement in the region has paradoxically restored political leeway to central government leaders while simultaneously contributing to undermining emancipatory development approaches. We identify these emerging trends associated with China's engagement with the region as increased political maneuvering space away from US and EU guidance, reinforcement of a narrow development trajectory, and weakening of social participation and subsequent consolidation of elite development thought. Regarding the first of these trends, the introduction of Chinese finance in the region has allowed regional leaders to triangulate in search of better credit terms. Chinese loans have been used to roll back neoliberal reforms, but to honor existing debts and increase public spending on infrastructure. Chinese investments and finance are also limited in terms of content, and as such, they foment a narrow developmental template. Here it is important to note that the current wave of Chinese investment as part of the Belt and Road Initiative responds not to benevolent goals, but to a crisis of overaccumulation in China's construction sector. Therefore, these investments are constrained to a limited number of sectors and tend to emphasize infrastructural growth and natural resource exploitation. China's engagement in the region has also narrowed the scope of social participation. Infrastructural agreements are reached by government-to-government negotiations and bypass open tenders. This has consolidated a model of top-down elite-led governance and promotes transparency and participation in terms of decision-making and scrutiny. Projects are approved without standing the test of public deliberation, and as such, they cannot serve as the basis for a truly emancipatory developmental paradigm. A narrow developmental vision seems to align with the capabilities and interests of Chinese investors that were brought together with the constraints that local political and business elites face in envisioning long-term development goals. So the other area that we kind of extracted from Caribbean critical development thought was that of passive incorporation in the global economy. Critical Caribbean development thought scholars have often remarked how the region was passively incorporated into the international economy, a trend that is not divorced from the question of epistemic dependency. Passive incorporation entailed a structurally subservient economic role during the colonial years, persistent economic dependency in the immediate post-colonial period, and extreme vulnerability in the world market amid high levels of liberalization since the 1980s. The chapter therefore shows how the Caribbean-Chinese relationship facilitates passive incorporation in the global economy by highlighting the following constraints in the relationship: the exacerbation of production hierarchies and trade imbalances, the structural limitations associated to the types of Chinese investment available in the region, and the ways in which low transparency impedes the effective regulation of investment flows. Trade between China and the Caribbean has risen exponentially. Commodity exporters have enjoyed a growing demand for their products like oil and gas, timber, etc. However, all Caribbean economies import finished manufactured goods from China, which has resulted in negative trade balances. This pattern pushes developing countries out of manufacturing sectors and further into a commodity producing role. The region faces high current account trade balances resulting from a low level of diversification of markets and products, and erosion of preferences of agricultural commodities and garment exports as one of the highest debt burdens in the world relative to economic size. The Caribbean faces a number of additional problems, such as graduation from bilateral and multilateral grants and other forms of concessional lending. High levels of poverty and income inequality persist despite good progress on human development, burdensome conditions for the repayment of international loans, the threat of termination or restriction of correspondent banking services and participation in the global banking system because of the perception of high risk associated with doing business in the region. And the focus of Chinese investment on infrastructures or consolidated sectors or tourism exacerbates these trends. China's investments and loans in infrastructure surpass other areas of development, with 18 out of 23 loans of China's policy banks in the region concentrated in that sector. Without careful planning, large infrastructural projects will struggle to generate sufficient economic capacity to make up for a rising debt burden. The questions of labor opportunities and technology transfer have been points of contention. Overall, there are serious concerns that Chinese firms may be undercutting national contractors thanks to the series of privileges rather than the inherent competitiveness. These include access to inexpensive credit, tax breaks and duty-free concessions on equipment and material, and exclusive access to cheap Chinese labor. The counter-arguments here would be that infrastructure can produce productive capacity and that the Chinese state has provided a number of scholarships for Caribbean citizens to pursue an education in China. Yet, while improvements in logistics or skills training can indeed result in positive outcomes, the questions of foreign capital, control, and passive incorporation remain, while the Caribbean continues to endure one of the world's highest levels of youth unemployment and immigration of tertiary educated and skilled individuals. And now we go to the very important area. One more minute. Okay, well, I'll just summarize regional integration. And so one of the areas that the engagement of China and the Caribbean has impacted is regional integration because of the One China policy. China engages with the Caribbean, cannot engage with the Caribbean as one because some Caribbean countries have relations with Taiwan. So that's definitely a negative and a disadvantage for regional integration. We know that China prefers to deal bilaterally by nature. That is how they do their business. And I want to just end, and I hope I'll have an opportunity to say more about that, about the post-colonial condition, as well as some final words about what that means for us. Shirley, will you allow me to just for one minute, just say, in light of the developments that are happening around the world, especially in the US, and the chaos that we see happening around us, and what my fellow esteemed our editors and my esteemed colleagues have said, there is definitely a need to take a step back and to see where it is we are going. And I think this is the time to really take to have some serious reflections and to think, what do we learn from where we've come from? What are the current circumstances? Because obviously the circumstances have changed and we can't just take frameworks and models wholesale and just apply them. We have to think about where we are, what are the areas that need to be nuanced and kind of modified to fit the current circumstance. But I want to say three things. We need to have a decolonization project as a Caribbean civilization. It's happening. I know it's happening a little bit in the Caribbean, in some circles, in some pockets. Even on my esteemed colleagues here, and by virtue of this project, it's definitely happening. But we need to have a strategic and wide-scale decolonization project, and the University of the West Indies, along with other universities in the South, they need to be part of this. It needs to be targeted, it needs to be strategic and deliberate, not of pockets of people doing something here and there, and it is just ad hoc and all over the place and just sort of coming together. The other thing that's important is that we need to know that change, especially paradigm shift and proper change, have happened as a result of intellectual shifts. Right? The neoliberal project was as a result, or it was an intellectual project by developed countries, the US and the EU and the UK at the helm, using the IMF and the World Bank to push research through those institutions to change development thinking, because we know that we had development thinking that was in our favor. And it was research, but it was an intellectual project that was just like the decolonization project. It was deliberate, it was strategic, and it was backed by research. Of course, power, comes with that as well, because they have the power to push it as well. And the Caribbean needs to think about that. How do we challenge what is happening if we do not have this coherent sort of, approach to it? And then therefore, there's definitely a role for civil society. There's a role for whatever we are doing for it to be people-centered, and people have to be involved in it. And I think that the University of the West Indies is very well placed to be part of that. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Dr. Montoot, and thanks very much to everyone here. We are at our time limit, so I'm going to stop the recording. But if anybody stays, then I think we can have 2 or 3 more minutes for discussion. And you can speak freely. You are no longer being recorded. So thank you so much to everyone for being here. And I'd like to open up the floor now for discussion, questions, comments.